actually change it to whatever we want. We can actually change it to something like red. Save it, refresh, and we get a red shadow. So this is basically how shadows work. We have a horizontal position, a vertical position, blur, and color. So don't worry, the more that you work with shadows, the more you'll get familiar with what these 4 values can do. So let's try creating a more realistic shadow. Usually shadows aren't red or any color. They're usually kind of a darker shade of whatever they're covering. So to create a color like that, we're going to need a new way of measuring color. So let's get rid of this, and we're going to use something called RGBA. RGBA is the same thing as RGB, except there's an A value. So this A value essentially means the opacity of the color, how see-through it is. We can set the RGB to 000. That gets us to black, as we learned. And then the 4th value is our A value. If we set it to 1 and save, this is going to be pure black. But as we decrease the A value, the color is going to get more and more faded out and more transparent. So if we decrease it to 0.6, save and refresh, now this color is getting more transparent and faded out. So a pretty natural color for a shadow is something pretty faint, like 0.15. So for shadows, we usually don't want it to be too noticeable. Shadows are best when they're very subtle. And now we kind of want to move the shadow a little bit closer to the button so it looks a little more natural. So let's actually move it maybe 5 pixels and 5 pixels. Let's see how that looks. Save it and refresh. Okay, I think that looks pretty good. So that's how we create a natural looking shadow with the box shadow property. We have 4 values: the horizontal position, vertical position, the blur, and the color measured with RGBA. The A value means opacity, or how see-through this color is. The final step of this lesson is to only make this shadow appear when we hover over the button. So for example, for here, if we hover over, we can see the shadow. If we're not, the shadow's gone. So this is another style of button that we can create. So let's use what we learned so far. Remember, we first use a dot to target the class. So we're going to target the tweet-button class. We're going to add a pseudo class here called hover. And then we're going to move our shadow into the hover pseudo class. Let's cut and paste in here. So remember, the way this works is that, let's refresh first. If we are not hovering over the button, we get all of these styles. If we are hovering over the button, we're going to get these styles, these hover styles, as well as all of these. So these styles get added on when we hover. So now when we refresh and we hover over this button, we're going to get a pretty subtle shadow. It's not perfect, but I think it's close enough to what we want. Now the last thing we're going to do is to transition the shadow. So we can actually transition the shadow pretty easily by just adding the transition property. And we're going to tell it what we want to transition and how long. So we want to transition the box-shadow. And let's transition it to something natural, like 0.15 seconds. Now save and refresh. Now when we hover over this button, we get a nice transition on the shadow like this. All right, so the last thing we're going to do is, I realized I forgot to change the durations here. So let's change it to 0.15 and 0.15. Let's save it and refresh. So now this looks something like what we have in our designs. So we just learned some intermediate HTML skills, such as creating hover effects, other pseudo classes, transitions, and shadows. Here are some more exercises from famous websites that you can try to copy. This time we're also going to copy the hover styles. As always, you can find these solutions and more exercises below the video. In this lesson, we're going to learn about one of the most useful tools for web development called the Chrome DevTools. And we're going to use the DevTools to get perfect colors for our buttons. So first of all, what are the Chrome DevTools? So I find that it's a lot easier to demonstrate it than to try to explain it. So let's go to our website. And we're going to right click in an empty area. And we're going to click Inspect. And this will open up the DevTools. So the cool thing about this is that we can now see all the HTML on our page. If we drill down here, we can see all the buttons. So this is a great way to visualize the HTML as well as the CSS on our page. If I click into one of these buttons, I can see all the CSS that is applied to this button. So what's even better is that we can open the DevTools in any website that we want. So we can actually open it in supersimple.dev. And you can see all the HTML that is on this website, as well as all the CSS. So this is a really great tool where you can open it in any website that you want and see the exact styles that they're using on that website. The next feature I want to show you is this pointer icon in the top left. So instead of trying to find these buttons in all of this HTML, we can actually click this pointer icon and it will let us hover over any element on the web page and show it down here. So if we hover over this tweet button and click it, it will find the element for us in the HTML. And now we can look at these styles here to see what kind of styles and more importantly, what kind of background color is set on this button so that we can get a perfect background color. So one thing to note is that this background color is actually another way of measuring color. So currently we learned about RGB. Now we have another way of measuring color, and this is called hex. It's basically the same as RGB. The first two characters here, 1 and D, represent how much red, the second two represent how much green, and the third two represent how much blue. So with a little bit of math, we can convert from hex to RGB. So I just Google a hex to RGB calculator, and I find any calculator, and then I use it to convert the hex value. So I'm going to copy this into the calculator and then convert it, and it will give me the RGB value. So it'll do that math for me. So that's just another way of measuring color called hex. The next feature I want to show you in the DevTools is this Computed tab. So this tab actually shows us all the final styles that are applied to this element. So we can actually scroll down here and we can find the background color in the RGB value. We can also find things like the height, the final calculated height, the final calculated width, so that we can get the perfect size as well as the perfect background color. So let's actually just use the background color here. And we're going to copy this and paste this into our code. So we're going to get an exact color instead of trying to guess it like we were before. So if I copy and paste here, save it, and now I refresh, now our button has the exact same color as what we have here. So the same thing happens for the join button. Let's click this icon here and hover over the join button to find it in the HTML, click, and now we can see all these styles, all the final computed styles on the join button. So most importantly, we can find the border color, which is this. Let's copy it and put it into our CSS so that we can get a perfect color. End it with a semicolon to follow the syntax rules. Okay, copy it there and copy it here. Now we're going to save, refresh, and now our button color is going to match the design exactly. So that's how you use the DevTools to get perfect color for our HTML elements. Now we're going to learn about the CSS box model, which basically allows us to add space between our elements like this, as well as add space inside our element to make it bigger. The first part of the box model is spacing on the outside of the element. This is called margin. If we look at our code, we already worked with margin before. Here we set the margin right to 8 pixels. That means that we added space on the outside of the button on the right of 8 pixels. If we change the margin right to 30 pixels, for example, and save and refresh, now there's 30 pixels of space on the outside on the right side of the button. So we can add margin to all 4 directions: top, right, bottom, and left. Let's try adding margin to the left side of the button this time. We're going to add margin left of 20 pixels. Save it and refresh. And that adds space on the outside of the button on the left of 20 pixels. So that's basically how margin works. It lets us add spacing on the outside of the element. The second part of the box model is spacing on the inside of the element. So basically all the spacing in here around our text. So currently, if we look at our code, we're setting the height and width of our buttons. And this is not actually a good idea. I'll show you why. I'm going to scroll down to the join button because it's a little easier to see. And I'm going to change the text to join my channel. Save it and refresh. And you'll notice that the text is actually overflowing the button like this. And that's because if we scroll up, we're setting the height and the width. That means that we're forcing the button to have a height of 36 pixels and a width of 62 pixels. But here, notice that our content is too big. So what we want to do is to remove these lines and save it and refresh the page. And by default, our button actually adjusts the size automatically based on the content. So now instead of setting the height and the width, we're going to achieve the same thing by adding spacing on the inside of the button. So the spacing on the inside of the button is called padding. Let's go into our code and give it a try. So we're going to add padding -left of 30 pixels. Save it and refresh. And you can see that padding adds spacing on the inside of the button. And just like margin, we can set padding in all 4 directions. So let's try adding padding -top to 20 pixels. Save that and refresh. And now you can see that we added padding on the top by 20 pixels. So we can actually use the Chrome Dev tools that we learned earlier to visualize the margin and padding of our elements. Let's go into a blank area of our web page, and we're going to right click and inspect, and then click this top left icon, and then click our subscribe button. So I'm going to drag this down, and then we're going to go into the computed tab. So this section is basically the box model. We have our margin, which is the space on the outside of the element. You can see that highlighted in orange. We have the border, which we learned earlier, and we have the padding, which is the space on the inside of the element, which you can see highlighted in green. Buttons by default have a padding of 6 pixels on the left and right, and 1 pixel on top and bottom. So let's click this top left again and go to our join button and click this button. In this example, we have padding on the top of 20 pixels, which is what we have in our code. We have padding on the left of 30 pixels, also what we have in our code. And then we have a default padding of 6 pixels on the right and 1 pixel at the bottom. And for this button, we have a border of 1 pixel wide, which you can see here in our code. So all of these combined make up the CSS box model. This basically determines how much space an element takes up on the page and how far it is away from other elements. So now that we learned the box model, we're going to use it to recreate our design here. So currently, if we look at our code, we're using height and width. Let's replace this with the box model. Let's get rid of this and save it and refresh. And now our button's back to what it was before. And now we're going to add padding to this button so that it matches the design at the bottom here. So let's add some padding -top of 10 pixels. So we'll add spacing on the inside of the button at the top here of 10 pixels. We're also going to add padding -bottom of 10 pixels. So let's save that and refresh. Okay, so now we have space at the top and bottom. So that looks pretty close. We're also going to add space on the inside, on the left and right. So we're going to add padding dash left of 16 pixels and padding on the right of 16 pixels. So let's save that and refresh. And I think this looks close enough. So using padding, we added spacing on the inside of our button. And the good thing about this is that if we change the text like this and save it and refresh, the button will resize with the text, but it will keep the spacing on the inside. So using padding is a better alternative to height and width. So let's save that and refresh the page. And let's actually move these buttons back closer together. So currently, if we scroll up, we have margin on the right of 30 pixels. So spacing on the outside of the button on the right of 30 pixels. We're going to change it back to 8 pixels so that it's closer like we have in our design. Save it and refresh. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Now, one thing you'll notice is that our buttons are not aligned with each other. So the join button is all the way at the top, while our subscribe button is a little bit below. So why is this happening? By default, the browser tries to align our buttons based on the text. So notice that the text is in one line like this. So that's the default behavior of the browser. This is because browsers in the beginning were mostly text-based. Now to override this behavior and align everything to the top like we had before, we can go into our CSS and we're going to add a property called vertical-align. And we're going to set this to top. So instead of aligning the buttons based on the text like this, we're just going to align everything to the top. If we save that and refresh, now the subscribe button is aligned to the top, which is right there. Let's do the same thing for the tweet button. We're going to scroll down and we're going to add vertical-align : top here as well. Save and refresh. And now everything's aligned properly again. Now let's work on the join button. I'm going to scroll down and remove this extra text here. Save it and refresh. And now we're going to go to our CSS for the join button. So I'll scroll up to right here and we're going to adjust the padding. So let's actually just borrow the padding from the subscribe button because they look pretty similar. So I'll scroll up here and copy these and just move them down to the join button right here. Save that and refresh. Okay, so that looks pretty good, except our join button looks a little bit off. It looks a little bit taller than our subscribe button. And that's because the border actually adds a little bit of size to this button. So it adds 1 pixel on the top and bottom. That's why this button is taller than the subscribe button. So to compensate, we're actually going to reduce the padding at the top and the bottom by 1 pixel. Save it and refresh. And now they're the same size. We have 9 pixels of space on the inside plus the 1 pixel of the border width. And that matches the 10 pixels of space on the inside of the subscribe button. And I'll leave changing the tweet button up to you as an exercise. So that is the CSS box model. Every element can have spacing on the outside called margin, space on the inside called padding, as well as a border. And these properties determine how much space an element takes up on the page. Here's some exercises of using the box model to get yourself more familiar with this concept and these properties. For most of the course, we've been working with buttons. In this lesson, we're going to work with text, and we're going to learn how to style text. So just like our button lesson, I've created an exercise that we can practice with text. So we're going to go to supersimple.dev/exercises/text. And now we have some text from YouTube and Apple that we're going to learn how to copy. So first of all, let's create a new HTML file where we can focus on practicing text styles. So I'm going to go here and create a new file. And let's just call this text.html. And now we're going to open this file in our browser. So open the folder that contains our code and right-click, open with Google Chrome. I'm actually going to put this up here. All right, so now we're ready to begin. If you've ever written a text document before using something like Google Docs or Microsoft Word, you've probably seen something like this. This is a toolbar that allows us to change the style of our text. We can change the font, the text size, we can make it bold, we can center it, etc. In CSS, we have a style for each of these things. Let's go to our code, and we're going to first start by creating some text on our page. So let's first create a paragraph. And then inside our paragraph, let's start with the text here. So I'm going to copy and paste this into our paragraph. And I'm just going to reorganize the code a little bit and save. Remember that in HTML, these extra spaces and new lines don't matter. Now refresh the page, and we have our first paragraph that we can practice with. Next, let's create a style element so we can write some CSS code. Now we'll set a class on this paragraph so that we can target it in CSS. Class equals video-title, because this is a video title that I copied from YouTube. So let's save it and refresh. And now we can start targeting this paragraph in our CSS. So remember, we're going to start with a dot to target a class, and we're going to target video-title. So the first thing we're going to change is the font. To change the font, the CSS property is font-family. So websites by default use the font called Times New Roman. We're going to change the font to a font called Arial. Save it and refresh. And now you can see we changed the font. Let's go to the next one. So this is the font size. And we can change the font size using the property font-size. And let's change it to something like 30 pixels. Save it and refresh. And now we have a bigger font. The next example is let's make it bold. We're going to go here and we're going to set the font-weight to be bold. Save it and refresh. And now we have bold font. So as you can see, CSS has properties for doing all of these things. And for most of these properties, it's pretty easy to Google them. For example, let's Google for how to make a font italic. So we'll go to Google and we just need to search something like CSS text italic. And now in the first result, we're going to go in here. And if you scroll down, you can see this CSS font style italic. So I'm going to copy this and paste it in my code, save it and refresh. And now we have italic text. The last one I'm going to show you for now is how to center this text, because in our exercise, we have an exercise where the text is centered. To center text, we're going to go to our code and we're going to type text-align. So this is the property for centering text or putting it to the left or to the right. Now we're going to give a value of center. Save it and refresh. And that's how we center our text. So that was pretty easy, right? Now let's go ahead and try to copy this style in our exercise. So if you remember, the general strategy for creating anything that we see is first create the element with HTML and then style it with CSS one by one. Let's go ahead and do that for this exercise. So I'm just going to resize this back, and we're going to start by resetting all of these styles. Save it and refresh. First, I'm going to start with the font family. So for this exercise, I actually use the font family Arial just to make it easier for us. So we're going to set the font-family to Arial. Save it and refresh. Next, I'm going to change the font weight. So this font is bold, and I want to make my font bold as well. So we're going to add font-weight bold. Save it and refresh. Next, let's change the font size. So I'm going to change this font size to something bigger, like maybe 20 pixels. Save it and refresh. And it looks a little too big compared to the design. So let's tone it down just a little bit, maybe 18 pixels. Save and refresh. Okay, so I think that looks close enough. Next, you'll notice that this text sort of wraps around to a second line, while ours doesn't. The way to make this happen is we're going to set a width on this title. Now I know that in the previous section, we said it's bad to set a width, but here it's actually what we want. Because if we set a width, we're going to force the text onto a second line. So let's go ahead and set a width right now. And I'll set it to something like 400 pixels. Let's see how that looks. Save it and refresh. Okay, so it needs to be less than that. Let's do 300 pixels. Save and refresh. Okay, so that looks right to me now. And the final thing with the title is I notice there's more spacing between the lines here than what we have. So to adjust the spacing between lines, the property is called line-height. So don't worry if it seems like we're learning a lot of new properties. The point of this lesson is for us to go through some complicated examples together, which will prepare you for the exercises that you can practice on your own. So for this line height, let's try something like 20 pixels. Save it and refresh. Okay, so it looks like that didn't work. Let's change it to 26 maybe. Save it and refresh. Okay, maybe 24. Save and refresh. Okay, so I think that looks pretty close. Next, let's work on the second paragraph. So we're going to create a new paragraph. 3.4 M views. And now to create this dot, we're going to create something called an HTML entity. So an HTML entity lets us type out special characters. For example, this dot and this check mark. To get the HTML entity for this dot, we're going to Google HTML entity middle dot. And now if we scroll down, this will give us some HTML code that we can copy into our code. So I'm going to copy this and then paste it here. And that's going to create a dot on our page. So if I save it and refresh, that's what we get. Now I'm going to type out the rest of the text in this paragraph. Now let's save that and refresh. So now remember, the general process is we created the element with HTML. Now we're going to style it one by one. First, let's give this a class so we can target it. Let's call this video-stats. And now in our CSS, we're going to style this text. We're going to start with font-family Arial. Save and refresh. And then we're going to change the font size. So it looks like our design is a little bit smaller than what we have. Let's change the font size to maybe 14 pixels. Save and refresh. And I think that looks pretty close. Next, let's change the color. So let's set a color of maybe gray and refresh. Okay, so that's a little too light. So to get an exact color, we can right-click in a blank area of the web page, click Inspect, and then we're going to inspect the styles of this element. So the trick to doing that is we're going to click this top left icon, hover over this element and click it. And then we can find all its styles in the Computed tab. So if we scroll down, we can get the text color. So let's copy this and save. Let's refresh. And that looks pretty good compared to the design. Next, let's adjust the spacing between these two paragraphs. So remember from the previous lesson, the spacing outside of an element is called the margin. But if we look at our code, we didn't actually set any margin yet. So why is there so much space between these two paragraphs? And the reason is, if we right-click in an empty area of the web page and click Inspect, and we click this icon and hover over this paragraph already has margin at the top and bottom. So if we click this, go to Computed, it has 14 pixels of margin at the top and 14 at the bottom. And the same thing for this paragraph. And the reason for this is because paragraphs by default come with margin at the top and at the bottom. So that's why there's all this spacing that we have here where we didn't set it in the CSS. So the general process is we're going to remove the default spacing and then we're going to set our own spacing. So let's go into our code. And first we're going to remove the margin dash bottom of the title. Set that to 0. And we're also going to remove the margin at the top of the second paragraph and set it to 0. Let's save that and refresh. And now there's no default spacing between these and they're really close together. Next, we can set a more precise margin bottom. So let's set it to maybe 20 pixels. Let's see how that looks. Save it and refresh. Okay, so that's way too much space. Let's tone it down to something like maybe 5. Save and refresh. Okay, so I think this looks pretty close to the design actually. Let's move on to the next paragraph. We're going to move all the way down and create a new paragraph element with this text inside. And now for this check mark, we're also going to use an HTML entity. Now I know that you can actually copy this and put it into our code directly, but some browsers might not support this. So that's why we're using HTML entities. We're going to go to Google and we're going to search HTML entity check mark. And I'm going to scroll down and grab the HTML entity here. So here we actually have 3. I'm just going to take the first one. Copy, paste, save it. Let's go back and refresh. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Next, let's keep styling these one by one. So I'm going to go a little bit faster here because it's basically the same thing that we've been doing for the first two. Let's call this one video author. And then we'll style it up here. So we'll set the font family to Arial, like the rest of the paragraphs. I'm going to set the color to the same as this paragraph. So copy and paste. Okay, that looks pretty good. Oh yeah, we have to set the font size. It looks a little too big right now. Set the font size to 14 pixels. Next, we're going to reset the default spacing here. So we're going to set the margin dash bottom and remove it by setting it to 0. And also remove the margin top and set it to 0. Save and refresh. And now we're going to set a more precise margin. So let's try maybe 30 pixels. See how that looks. Okay, that's way too much. Maybe 20 pixels. Okay, I think that looks about right. Then we're going to do the third paragraph. Let's go down here, create the element, and then style it with CSS. I'm just going to copy and paste this in here. Save and refresh. First, let's give a class to the text so that we can target it. Let's call this video-description. Go up here, video-description. We want a font family of Arial, a font size of 14 pixels, and the same color. And we save it and refresh. Okay, that looks pretty good. And now we want to give it a width to make it wrap around like this. So let's set the width to the same as the title, which is 300. Width 300 pixels. Save and refresh. Okay, so it looks like this IO is actually on a separate line. Let's make it 280. Save and refresh. All right, so that looks pretty good. And I'm also gonna make it 280 up here, just to make sure they're the same. So the last thing I'm gonna change is the height or the space between these lines. To do that, we're gonna use line height. Let's scroll down and then add another property called line-height. And let's set this to 20 pixels. Let's see how that looks. Save and refresh. And let's set it to maybe 22 pixels. Save and refresh. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with this. And lastly, we're going to modify the space between these two paragraphs. First, we're going to reset the default margin. Let's get rid of the margin bottom on the first one here and the margin top on the second one. So margin-top, I'm going to get rid of it and set it to 0. Save and refresh. And then we're going to set a margin bottom. Maybe the same thing as up here, 20 pixels. Save and refresh. All right, so that looks really good to me. We just recreated a really nice looking style that you can find on youtube.com. And the general process that we use is first we created the elements with HTML, and then we styled them with CSS one by one. So before we move on to the next exercise, I'm going to show you a way to clean up our code. So if you notice, all of our styles right now have a line called font family Arial. Now we can actually clean this up and remove the duplication by creating a new style. This time we're going to target all paragraphs on the page, and we're going to give all paragraphs font-family: Arial. Save. So this style is going to apply to all paragraphs, which means all of these. That means that we actually don't need this line in any of these class styles anymore. So we can actually remove all of these. Now, if I save it and I refresh, you can see that nothing changes because this is doing the same thing as the code that we had before. So you can also see from this example that an element can be targeted by two sets of styles. For example, for this code here, we're targeting all P elements on the page and all elements with a class of video-title. If we scroll down here we have a P element that has a class of video-title, which means it's going to be targeted by both this set of styles and this set of styles. So it's being targeted by multiple sets of styles. Now, another thing that we can clean up is, remember how we reset the margins for all of our paragraphs? Instead of doing it for each one individually, we can actually put it all up here. So for example, we can set the margin-top to 0 and the margin-bottom to 0. We save it and we refresh. It looks pretty much the same, except we're now cleaning up all of the default styles up here so that we don't have to do it in our code at the bottom. So we don't need this anymore, or this, or this. If we save that and refresh, we still get the same thing because we've reset all of our styles in this set of styles. Now, the last concept I want to show you before we move on to the next exercise is the fact that in this set of styles, we're setting the margin bottom to 0. But here, we're also setting the margin bottom to 5 pixels and the margin bottom to 20 pixels. So how does that work? We're setting it to 0 here and to 5 and 20 here. Which style does the element actually get? And the answer is we're getting the style down here. So if we refresh, you'll notice that there's still 20 pixels of space between these two paragraphs. Now you might think that it's because this line is at the top, and then once we get to this line, it overrides anything that comes before it. But if we actually move this to the top and we save and reload, you'll see that we still have 20 pixels of margin bottom. So why is this happening? This is something called CSS specificity. If we have multiple lines setting the same property, there's actually a priority that the browser follows. So in this situation, this style has more priority than this style. And to determine which one has more priority, we have to look at this word before the brackets. So this word tells us what these styles are targeting. This is known as a selector. This is another selector that targets a particular class. Now the selector that is the most specific is going to have higher priority. So this selector is actually more specific than paragraphs. So what I mean by specific is that this targets all paragraphs on the page, and this targets a specific class. So not all paragraphs are going to have this class of video-stats. So that's why this is more specific. It targets a smaller group of elements than this. That's why this line has priority over this line. So that's just an introduction to CSS specificity. For now, just know that a class name like this has more priority than an element name like this. So I'm going to move this code back, and we'll continue with the rest of this exercise. Next, we're going to copy this text from Apple. So you can see that there is a background color and the text is centered. And also if I hover over this part of the text, we get a pointer on our mouse and we have an underlined text. So let's see how we can do this. First, we'll create the element and then we'll style it one by one. So we'll go down here and we're going to create a new paragraph. And let's copy this text into that paragraph. Let's copy and paste. Whoops. Okay, save it and refresh. Okay, so that looks good. So usually if you have a greater than or less than symbol, you want to create it with an HTML entity because the browser could confuse these symbols with an HTML tag. So I'm going to search for the HTML entity for greater than. So this is the symbol that we want. I'm just going to copy and paste this into our code. Save it and refresh. Next, let's actually add some space at the bottom of this paragraph so that we can see our new paragraph clearly. So we're going to go here and just add some margin to the bottom because it's a little bit too cluttered right now. All right, so that looks pretty good. We're going to start by adding a class to our paragraph so we can target it in our CSS. Class equals maybe apple-text. Save it and refresh. And apple text. Okay, and first I'm actually also going to give some spacing at the bottom, so it's easier for us to see our actual code. So 50 pixels at the bottom, save and refresh. And now it's a little easier to see what we're working with. So next, I'm going to change the font size. One thing you'll notice is that the font family is already Arial. If we scroll back up, we have this set of styles that target all paragraph elements. So it's already set our font family to Arial. Let's scroll back down and let's adjust the font size. So this one looks a little bit smaller. So let's set it to maybe 14 pixels. Let's see how that looks. Save it and refresh. Okay, so I think that looks pretty similar to the design. And now the next step is let's set a background color of red. Now a trick for getting the background color is we're going to right click in an empty area, inspect, click this icon, and click the element we want to copy styles for, and then go to the computer tab and scroll down. Now we have the background color. I'm just going to copy this and paste it in here. So background dash color. I'm going to paste that. Save and refresh. Okay. Next, we're going to do the text color. So let's set the text color to white. Color dash white. save and refresh. And now if we look at our design, this text is actually centered on the page. So remember, the property for centering text is text-align center. Save and refresh. Okay, and the last thing is there's some spacing at the top and the bottom here. So here we actually want to add spacing inside our paragraph. And remember from the previous lesson, spacing on the inside of an element is called padding. We're going to add some padding to the top, maybe 10 pixels, and then padding to the bottom, and 10 pixels. Let's see how that looks. Save and refresh. Okay, so I think we could add a little bit more padding. So let's change it to maybe 18 pixels. Save and refresh. All right, so I think this looks close enough. Now the last thing we're going to work on is this text here that becomes underlined when we hover over it. First, let's learn how to create underlined text. We're going to practice our Googling skills, and we're just going to search for CSS text underline. So keep it simple. And then in the first link, we have the text decoration property. We scroll down, we have an overline, line through, and underline. So let's grab this piece of code. I'm going to just copy it in here. Save and refresh. Now, unfortunately, this property actually affects the entire paragraph, but we want it to only affect this part of the text. So how do we do that? We're going to need to learn something called a text element. So a text element is an element that is inside a line of text. So let's do an example just to see how it works. We're going to go to the bottom and we're going to create a new paragraph to practice with. And let's actually just copy this text and put it in there. Save and refresh. And now we're going to create some text elements on this paragraph. So the first text element I'm going to show you is called the strong element. So now let's copy maybe this text and then put it in there. And save and refresh. So the strong element here creates this bolded text that you see on the web page. So the thing to know about text elements is that they essentially exist inside a line of text, and then they modify that part of the text. So they're not modifying the whole thing. Another text element we can create is the U element. So this one creates some text that is underlined. So if we move this text into here, save it and refresh, we now get an underlined text element. So that is how we style specific parts of a line of text. The final text element I want to show you is called the span. So let's create a span element. And we're going to put this text inside. So cut and paste. Save it and refresh. Okay, so the span element is here, but you'll notice that nothing changed. And that's because the span element is the most generic text element. It has no styles. So the span is really useful because we can actually give it a class and we can style it ourselves and give it any style we want. Now we could add the class attribute to these other text elements like the strong and the U element, but notice that these text elements come with a default style, and that may not be what we want, especially in this situation where we don't actually want a style until we hover over it. So that's why we use the span text element. It lets us modify a specific part of the text without affecting the whole thing, and it's the most flexible, and we can style it however we want. So if we give it a class of span example, and then go to our CSS, and then we target span example, we can give it any styles that we want. For example, we can set a color of red. Now if we save this and refresh, the span now turns this part of the text red. The other cool thing is that everything we know about CSS still applies. So we can target span example, colon, hover. And these styles will only apply when we hover over the span. So in this case, let's underline it because that's what we want. So if we do text dash decoration and underline, just like up here, save it and refresh. Now this span has a color of red here. And when we hover over it, these style apply and it's going to get underlined. Let's use what we learned here to finish up our example. We're going to first remove this line because we don't want to underline the whole thing. Let's refresh. And we want to create a span so that we only target this part of the text. Let's go back down. I'm going to resize it a little bit just so that we can see. Okay, so we're going to scroll down to here. We're going to wrap this in a span. Just going to move this into here. Save. Refresh. And now we're going to style this span. So remember, we're going to give it a class so that we can target it in our CSS. Let's call this the shop link. Save it and let's go here and we're going to style it now. So shop-link. So remember, the style for this is that the mouse turns into this pointer. So to do that, we're going to use the property cursor-pointer. Save and refresh. So now when we hover over it, our mouse is a pointer. And the last thing is that we want it to be underlined when we hover over it. So let's create a hover style, shop-link. And we're going to give this pseudo class colon hover. And we're going to underline it with text decoration underline. Save it and refresh. And now when we hover over this, it's going to turn our mouse into a pointer and it's going to underline it. So we've achieved the exact same styles as our design. So there's one last thing I'm going to show you in this lesson. Let's go back into our code. We're going to scroll all the way to the bottom and recall that in HTML, if we have multiple spaces like this, it will combine them all into one space. So if I save this and refresh, you'll see that only one space shows up here. So I'm going to show you how to get over this problem. Basically, instead of typing out multiple spaces in our HTML, all we have to do is set a margin left on this text element. So we're going to set a margin left on this element, and it's going to add spaces on the left. So as an example, let's scroll up, and we're going to add margin dash left to our span element here. And let's do something like 12 pixels. Save it and refresh. And now we have spacing between our words. So this is how we achieve multiple spaces between our words, even though HTML combines them. So that is how we create really professional looking text like this and like this. We first create the element with HTML, and then we style it one by one with CSS. And if we want to style only just a part of the text, we have to use a text element like a span. In this lesson, we're going to learn the proper structure of HTML, and that's going to give us access to all the features of HTML. So up until this point, we've actually haven't been following that structure. For example, if we look at our code, if we scroll down, we can see that we're creating elements directly like this. If we go to our website, however, and we right-click and inspect, and we look at our HTML, we can see that we have some elements here called the HTML element, the head element, and the body element. So this is the structure that we're actually supposed to have in our HTML file. And because we don't have it, the browser is automatically creating this for us. So this was fine in the previous lessons because we're just learning, but it's actually best to have this structure in our code because we're actually missing some useful features. So let's go ahead and learn what this structure is and add it to our code. So we're going to go back to all of our code and add in this structure. Let's go back to our very first HTML file. And at the top, I'm going to add some spaces and we're going to learn what the proper structure is. Every HTML file is going to start with less than, exclamation, doc type, space HTML, greater than. So you just have to type this line out exactly as I have it here. This is not really an element, it's just a special line that has a meaning to the browser. This tells the browser to use a modern version of HTML. If we don't have this, it sort of falls back to an older version that has less features. The next part of the structure is to create an HTML element. So this says there's a web page inside this element. There's not much meaning to it. We just have to have this at the top and the closing tag at the bottom of every HTML file. Next, we're going to create this head element. So head and closing tag, and we're going to create the body element. So body and closing tag. So this is the proper structure of all of our HTML files, and this is how we're supposed to start and end our files. So here you can see that we have an element inside another element. This is called nesting. So not only can we have text inside an element, we can have other elements inside elements. We've actually already seen an example of this in the previous lesson. We put a text element like a span inside a paragraph, and that allows us to have some text in the paragraph that was styled differently. Here we have our second example of nesting. We have a head and a body element inside an HTML element. So this doesn't actually do anything visually, unlike our previous example, but it's part of the HTML syntax rules that we have to follow. Every file has one and only one HTML element, and this element represents the entire web page. And the HTML element is designed for nesting. It's designed to contain one head element and one body element. And then everything on our web page is supposed to go either inside the head or inside the body. So both of these elements are also designed for nesting, or to have elements inside. The body element here is supposed to contain all the elements that are visible on the page. So let's actually open this website. We're going to go into our folder that contains our code, and we're going to right click, open with Chrome. So on this website, you can see that the paragraph is visible, the button, and the link is visible. So all of this is visible on the website, so it should go into this body section. Inside the head element are all the elements that are not visible on the page. So here's an example of such an element. We're going to create an element called title. So the text inside the title here is going to change the text in the tab here. So for example, if I use the text first website, that's going to show up in the tab. So if I save and refresh, that's where the title element shows up. But notice that this title element doesn't actually show up on the page, and that's why it belongs in the head section. So the title is the first feature that we get from following this structure. The second feature that we get that's really useful is the ability to automatically reload our web page whenever we change our code. So you may have noticed that every time we change our code, we have to go to our website and then refresh the page to see our new code. Now we can actually avoid this by following this structure and then installing a VS Code extension. So let's go to this extension area here, and we're going to install the extension Live Server. I'm going to install this. And now we can use the Live Server to reload our page automatically whenever our code changes. To open this website in a live server, we're going to right click and we're going to click Open with Live Server. And now we've opened this website and it will automatically refresh whenever we change our code. So if I change the code like this and I save, now it automatically refreshes without having us to go back and forth. So that's a really useful feature to speed up our development. Now let's get some more practice, and we're going to convert both of these HTML files